So, welcome to Documentary Filmmaking Professional Perspectives with Gillian Fritzsche and Ikhwan. I did not ask how to pronounce your last name. Rivai? You can correct me on that.
Rivai, yeah, that's
Rivai.
fine.
Perfect. Thanks. So we're about to get started with our webinar. This webinar is planned for about an hour and a half to give us time to both hold the initial panel discussion and time for you guys to submit your questions and for us to answer those. So we just have our initial section now with the housekeeping and introductions. We'll go over a couple of small rules. Then I'm going to give you just a quick little update on using Celtx with documentary filmmaking. Then we're going to go directly into our panel discussion, which will be about 40 minutes. And then we'll go into our questions that you submitted during the registration process. And then finally, we'll close up. I did want to let everyone know that we will be holding a giveaway from today's participants. So everyone who joined us today, we will be giving away one professional 5-seat studio free for a year to somebody who's attending today. So we'll be doing the draw for that after the webinar, and you can watch your emails. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the top of your screen, usually when you're in Zoom. We will be getting to the questions at the end. We probably are not going to have time for all questions, but we'll try. So feel free to use that Q&A feature if you have a particular question. If you just have a general comment or a general question, you can use the chat functionality, which is usually at the bottom right of your screen. If you do have a question that is not related to the topic of this webinar, we just ask that you hold on to that. You can send it to us afterwards. And any support-related questions having to do with your Celtx software are best sent to support@celtx.com. So joining me today, we have Gillian and Ikhwan. They're both going to introduce themselves in just a moment, but we have a little brief description of who they each are here. I'm going to be one of your hosts today. My name is Dara, and I'm the training lead here at Celtx. And Nicole is also going to be hosting today. Nicole is our community manager. If you've ever spoken to us on social media, you've probably spoken to Nicole. And Nicole is going to be handling the questions at the end. In terms of earlier, I mentioned use your Q&A, use your chat, use all of those functionalities in Zoom. When people are answering you from those, they're going to be Chelsea, Junior, and Laura. They all three work here at Celtx and on our support team. So inside Celtx, I did want to mention, we did notice a lot of questions come in, what format of script should I use when writing a documentary? And one of the things we've developed here at Celtx is called the MultiColumn AV project. So with a MultiColumn AV, you have your typical AV script with your storyboard and your shot list built right in. So one of the handy things with that is that you can start wherever you want. You can start in the script, you can start in the storyboard, you can start in the shot list, and continue developing as you go. You can create call sheets based upon what you need to capture in terms of your shots, and you can share with your creative team and crew. We do have a few professional clients who are using it, so we just included a little quote there from Ben at Lockheed Martin, who's basically saying that it's easier for people to understand visually with this MultiColumn AV script that we have. So thank you everyone for joining us here at Celtx. Before we get started, I just wondered if Gillian and Ikhwan, could you each tell us a little bit about yourselves, and in particular, the first time you ever made a documentary? Gillian, we can start with you, I guess.
I was going to say, Ikhwan has already had his mic unmuted. So
oh, I missed that.
Okay, now that I'm talking, I'll keep going. Yeah, so my name is Gillian Fritzsche. I live in New Jersey, just outside of New York City. I've been in this area a little over 10 years. Before that, I was in Los Angeles, originally from Canada. In fact, originally from Newfoundland, where Celtx is based. So that's a soft spot in my heart for you guys. Hi, Catherine in Newfoundland. So the first documentary that I ever made was actually at a provincial basketball tournament, probably in Corner Brook, Newfoundland, and I was there with my high school team, and I brought my grandfather's VHS camera with me, and I've now dated myself. But I recorded as much of that 3-day basketball tournament as I could. I got home, I had 2 VCRs, and I, cut it down back and forth, record until I had probably maybe a 12 to 15 minute highlight reel of the weekend. And then I made copies for all my friends on the team. So that was my first I'm going to do something that shows what the experience was like to be there. We just had such a great time. And there's a great shot where my friend gets hit by the basketball really, really hard. And there's an egg on her cheek afterwards. And it took 3 days to go down. So I got a great shot of that. It's I was there and I caught the moment, all that stuff. So, I mean, the bug of sharing true life experiences and trying to share them authentically hit me really young. And that was at the same time as I was doing theater and learning about film and all of that stuff. So for me, it's all kind of together in my life experience. And yeah, I came out of that out of my undergrad, and I ended up working in theater for several years before making the transition to mostly film. Dipped my toe a little bit back into theater. That transition wasn't even. There's a little back and forth and stuff, but yeah, now I'm mostly in film, both in narrative and in documentary.
That's awesome. Thank you. That sounds like it's like an early a video version of mixtapes, the way you made your highlight reel. And I'm now aging myself or dating my age. Ikhwan, did you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your first experience making a documentary?
Sure. I was born in North Borneo in Sabah, in sort of part of Malaysia. So it's quite a sort of, I guess, a rural state. Rural part of Malaysia. I'd like to think it's the best part of Malaysia, and it's a very touristy. It's a tourist destination. I guess you've got the mountains, the islands. It's a very beautiful place. So if you ever see sort of advertising about Malaysia, most of the images come from the state where I was born in. I didn't really think of myself as a film. I didn't think of filmmaking as a career growing up, really, and I kind of sort of fell into it, and I went to film school in Australia, and I think when I even entered, I didn't even think about documentaries. I guess I loved watching movies, but I had a couple of fantastic documentary lecturers, and they just proceeded to, I guess, narrate to me a history of documentaries, starting from the Nook, and of course in your show reel earlier you had Bowling for Columbine, and these are all sort of documentaries I remember from going through watching and writing about in film school, and I sort of came out of that, and I left Australia and went back to Malaysia, and I got a job in a very small boutique production company, and I was, I think, cutting vignettes for a couple of months, and at the time Discovery Channel Asia had this sort of this call. It was called the Firsttime Filmmakers. It's like a sort of initiative, and I think it was the second time they were running it, and so I put in a pitch for that, and of course, because I'm from Sabah, North Borneo, and there's a whole bunch of ethnic tribes, people, amazing stories over there, and I pitched a story from there, and it was about the Bajau seafarers, so they're nomadic seafarers, and my pitch got accepted, and I went and sort of made this documentary. So it was basically about how so some of the Bajau had settled on and become citizens of the land, but for the most part they're stateless people, and they live entirely at sea, and they had and the people that had settled onto land wanted to, I guess, had a festival every year, a boat festival, and it was to, I guess, reminisce of this time when there used to be nomadic and nomadic seafarers, and of course the ones that were still nomadic, they're these amazing people as well, and I think one of the guys I featured was this guy who could basically hold his breath for an unimaginable length of time, and he starts sort of walking on the ocean floor and start foraging for food, and you sort of see these images, and at that time when I saw it, and when I filmed it, it was like really eye-opening, and it was very unusual.
I'll say.
It was a interesting first thought. It wasn't kind of like I had the support of with the Firsttime filmmaker system, so it wasn't. It wasn't like I was left alone sort of thing. There was a support system there, and they helped me along this way of making this, I guess, turning my pitch into a show, and that was my first show. Yeah.
That's amazing. I've seen, because I've visited your website and everything. I've seen that documentary, and that was your first one. Like, wow.
Yeah, it was quite a, yes, it was, but it was interesting at the time. And the people that I met, I think one story that somehow sticks with me that I always sort of remember is going there and talking to these people and says, hey, I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna film you, in a week's time. Can I meet you here in this spot in the ocean? And it's like, and then you have to think, okay, hang on, these guys don't really have the same sense of time as we do. They don't have a watch, and they don't have. So then I was with my a boatman there, and we were like trying to figure out how to tell these guys. We said, okay, let's get a piece of paper, and we tore these notches on the paper, and said, okay, look, every time the sun comes up, tear one notch off, and when you reach this last notch, you sort of come to this place in the ocean where you're sort of aligned with this island and that island, and we'll meet you here in 7 days, and it was interesting. It was it was very interesting. But I mean, obviously, I think at the time I don't know how I got through it, but there was a support system then.
That's so funny. You know how they say in narrative filmmaking, don't start with children or water. Never bring up, don't start with people who can't tell time. Or don't tell time the same way we tell time. That's an incredible challenge to overcome as a first-time documentary filmmaker. That's amazing.
A little bit tricky, yes.
That is very impressive. And it must have been a very eye-opening experience, as you say, just experiencing this whole, not just another culture, but a culture that's very different from yours, right? So that must have been really, really interesting. So Gillian, you mentioned earlier that you came to documentary filmmaking with that background in theater and having moved into doing some film production, although you were doing documentary way back when you were in theater too, but how do you feel that documentary filmmaking is separate from other forms of storytelling, and how is it similar?
So I was thinking about this, and I think it's not easy to simply give you a list of, like a fifth grader. Here's the list in ways it's similar, and here's the we have to talk about storytelling. Like that's the root of it all. And I mean, imagine we're sitting around a bonfire and it's at night and we're all telling stories, and you really can't say in that moment which of those are true and which of those are not. But you can say, which of those do I respond to? Which of those does everyone in the group respond to and feel like, well, that was a great story. Or did I get something out of that? Like, did I learn something meaningful for my life from that? You know, you can say this is a true story, but I don't know if that's the truth when you say it. So what I come back to is this idea of kind of a universal truth and a universal authenticity. And, you know, you can have a documentary that has a combination of interviews, B-roll, which could be something you're watching your subjects do something. It could be the inserts. It could be a beautiful sunset, you know, B-roll. And then you have reenactments, just for argument's sake in this point. And you've set up something to film as if, you know, we're watching as it actually happened, but we know it's something that we've reenacted. And so you think about that reenactment, basically that's what narrative filmmaking is. It's a really long or short reenactment of a story that someone has written or is telling. They could be based on biography, based on real life. They could be based on someone's imagination that they've come up with. But the ones that stick with us, the narrative reenactments that stick with us, are the ones that have a sense of authenticity to them, have a sense of universal truth to them. Oscars, BAFTAs, they're the ones that are going to be the ones that have weight, that last, you know? And so when you come back to documentary, you go, okay, the documentaries that rise to the top, that the ones that people talk about, the ones that people you have to see this, they're the ones that have a similar effect on people.
Right.
Does it tell a universal truth? Does it have meaning in this society, in this culture, in this age? And so we're going to get to a question later about objectivity and authenticity, and my foreshadowing here is, so the idea is that documentary is based on a true story. Okay. Is that the difference? If you go back technically, documentary is, I have an interview and I have some B-roll, I'm cutting it together, here you go. You know, and I think a lot of narrative filmmakers, when they think about documentary, think, I don't want to be a documentary filmmaker. Think about it in that limited way. And I did. I was like, I don't want to be a documentary filmmaker. I want to be narrative and tell the fun and exciting stories. But as I've gotten into documentary filmmaking, I realized that I don't have to be limited by that recreation and just be in a you know, I've just be in that reenactment situation. I can do lots of things in documentary. I can be there when it happens. I can go ask somebody, what were you thinking when you said that? You know, I can go talk to other people that might have different opinions about what they said when they said that. You know, like there's so much freedom and in documentary to, I'm going to say create a story, but dig deeper, make discoveries. So how is documentary different? I'm going to say you have more freedom. There are restrictions. Like if I'm going to try to tell a documentary about something that happened 100 years ago, okay, I can't go ask the person. So there's, you know, there's some restrictions there, but depending on the story you want to tell, there's so much you can do with that. You know, with theater, what you're doing in that moment is trying to make it real for the audience, trying to find that authentic connection, make them feel like they're there with that actor on the stage. I don't know, I saw Tom Hanks in a role a couple of years ago, and, you know, I've seen him in When Harry Met Sally, You've Got Mail, so many other films that I can't recall right now, but like, when he was on that stage, he was that actor, he was that character, and I believed it. I believed him in that role, in that space, in that moment. And that's the goal, to believe that that's actually breathing and living in front of me in theater. And the same thing with film. You know, directors are looking for actors to bring an authentic moment, to bring realism that we believe, no matter the genre, horror, farce, Hallmark. Is that a genre? You're looking for the actors to bring the authenticity to that moment. With documentary, you have the opportunity in many cases to have the authenticity right there. To have the person that's doing it right in front of you, to capture it. If you're capturing, a 3-year race against time to build the largest stained glass window in the world, which is really great, which is playing in things in film festivals right now. You have the opportunity to say, okay, you were the person that either committed this crime or that the crime was committed against. Tell us what it was like. And the authenticity is there. Now we can get into later the challenge of crafting questions that we get good answers out of so that we can, do that. But that, I think, is my answer to how is documentary different. There's a lot more freedom.
That is an interesting take that I wouldn't have personally anticipated, but I think it's I think you've explained it really well. Ikhwan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we moved on, or?
I don't really have anything to compare documentaries to. So, but what I will say is that I'm still very interested in film, and I read a lot of sort of film books. I read a lot of books on screenwriting and structure and story, and when I sort of look at them and look at documentaries, I actually don't really see this sort of gaping hole. I see more similarities than anything else. I think they're quite. At the end of the day, I find storytelling is storytelling. It doesn't matter what sort of medium you're telling it on. It's a story. So yeah, but I don't have anything really to compare it to because I've only worked in documentaries.
Right. Yes. No, that's great. That's interesting. With your different backgrounds, that you both come back to that same general idea: story as a story. So in terms of that, Ikhwan, and I know you're going to correct me on this, you've worked on both those longer style documentaries as well as shorter current affairs projects. When it comes to within documentary itself, those two different styles or eventual end products, let's say, do you feel the process is the same regardless? Or do you need a different style of documentary filmmaking for a different approach to the subject or a different end product?
How I'll sort of rephrase that is
yes, go ahead.
That I guess what I'll compare is the shows I sort of made sort of a couple of years ago versus the shows I'm sort of making now. The shows that I made a couple of years ago was probably documentaries that had a lot where we had a lot more time to develop them. So we had lots of time to do research, and then we even you can even say, okay, look, for example, if I go back to the Bajau documentary that I made, the best time of the year to film that was sort of between February and March. So you can decide, okay, we'll have to wait for this period of time when this thing's going on. So that's I guess the type of documentaries that I used to make. You have more time to sort of, I guess, craft it, a little more time to wait for the sun to be in the right position in a sense. And the sun and the moon to align or whatever it is. And whereas the past couple of years I've been making what I call, I think it's just a personal thing though. I'm sure other people have different sort of ways to classify it, but I make sort of current affairs style documentaries. And why I call them current affairs style documentaries is because I don't have that luxury of time anymore. We just have like really fast turnaround times, and it's a little bit more reactionary. So, for example, if an earthquake happens in Indonesia, so I think the first earthquake that I attended to in Indonesia, I think it happened off the island of Palu, which sorry, I beg your pardon. It's off Lombok, so it's next to Bali.
Okay.
If that's a little bit easier to locate. So there was a sort of an earthquake there, and I think it happened on a Sunday, and I went into work on a Monday, and basically, everybody was like saying, "Hey, we've got to do a show about this," and says like, "If I'm going to go," and I said, "Okay," like, and then like you have to leave on Friday. So I would say I don't react in terms of in terms of news how they react, but we're sort of one step behind. What I'd say, but again, we do 1 hour docs or 1 hour current affairs shows, so it's more in depth than news. But I mean, I sometimes tend to not call them documentaries, even though some people do. I just call them current affairs shows. It's a personal thing. So yeah, so I guess time is something that has changed a lot if I compare like the shows that I did do and the shows that I do now.
That's interesting. I know, Gillian, you don't go rushing into earthquake zones or anything in your filmmaking. But did you have anything you wanted to add to what Ikhwan had said? I know it's a slightly different professional scenario than yours is, but was there anything you took out of that?
Yeah, I think, initially the question is the process the same, regardless whether you're doing something shorter or something longer? That's a good question for narrative filmmakers. Do you have a different process for a short versus a feature, and they accomplish different tasks? So it's a fair question to ask. But the interesting thing when you think about documentary, I could go set up a camera at a playground and shoot for 15 minutes or shoot for an hour and a half, and then I have a piece of video that is either 15 minutes long or an hour and a half long. And it took me under 2 hours to capture this video. Or I could film someone for 3 years doing almost everything they do every day and end up with 3,000 hours of footage, depending on how long I spend with them each day. And cut that down into a 15-minute documentary, which would take a really long time, but you can do that. Or I can follow one person for a day and end up with a 2-hour documentary about their day, depending on how compelling that day is, how compelling the character is. Do we have a story in that day? So for me, it's such a frustrating answer, but it's going to depend. It depends on the story. It depends on the character. It depends on what you're doing. All of that. I think,
Right.
Traditionally, if you're pitching and you're doing a doc for HBO, you say, listen, we're going to go for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. We're going to shoot. We're going to come back. We're going to cut it in 4 weeks, and you're going to have a copy at the end of 8 weeks. So, that's like plan well. Make sure the people that you're working with tell the time the same way you do and show up at the same time you do in the same place that you do. That's kind of normal. But when you're working on your own, you want to tell a story that matters to you, that matters to your community. It can be a story that you go and film in 1 day. It could be a story that you spend a year. And how you cut that down and what length you cut that down, I'll say make it the length it needs to be. That would be my answer to that.
Interesting takes. So you're both, like I said, you're both from such different backgrounds, but you share a lot of the same ideas about the story and the length of time capturing it. Ikhwan, what's the typical turnaround on those current affairs shows that you do? Is it a 1 week kind of, or shorter?
So no, it's not really not that short. So mostly, for the most part, it's a 7-week turnaround time.
Okay.
So that means we go and shoot it, and we come back and we edit it and do everything within 7 weeks.
Yeah.
That being said, of course, something like an earthquake or those shows would be expected to be turned around within like 2 to 3 weeks.
Right. Okay. That's what I was wondering. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So we just have a couple more questions, and then we're going to move into our questions from the community stage. Gillian had alluded to this question earlier, and I'm sure you both have a bit to say about it. But as a writer, a director, do you struggle with finding the truth behind the stories you tell? And is objectivity important to you, or is the story told better through a subjective lens? And we'll start with Gillian, because she mentioned earlier she was waiting for this question.
I baited myself. Well, I might get in trouble for this, and if you want to come find me on Twitter afterwards and argue with me, totally fine. But I think objectivity is impossible. And I think that if you're not coming from a news perspective, and people who work in news feel very strongly about objectivity, that's fine. But if you're not coming from a news perspective, I think you have to acknowledge as a storyteller that objectivity is impossible. And the goal is authenticity. And back to that example of a camera at a playground. I set up a camera at a playground, and the reason why this is in my head is I have 2 children. I brought them to a playground. But, set that up. I filmed the whole thing. Who pushed who knocked the other person down, what happened afterwards. But I have the whole thing from one angle. And maybe there was a playground structure in front of it. And maybe something happened behind that I didn't see. It's a perspective. What if I have 2 cameras? What if I have 3? I still don't have what they're thinking in their heads. What someone said the other day that they're still thinking about, that they want to retaliate for. I don't have all that. And even if I interview them afterwards and say, why did you hit your sister? He's going to make a choice about what to tell me. Yeah. And that, what he knows about how I will discipline him may affect his choice about what he tells me. There's so much that goes into hindering us from complete objectivity and complete truth. And so I think as storytellers, when we have that liberty and freedom, we have to acknowledge that there are all of these barriers to a whole and honest truth. And recognize where they are, recognize that they're in our subjects, they're in where our camera is, and they're in our upbringing and perspective. So we can course correct as we tell the story, as we put it together. I, as a mother, can bring in everything I know about my son and my daughter and how they, and tell the story that way. And that's going to, if that's something that, other children respond to or whatever, and my kids will watch it and go, that's not how it happened, it's still not going to be, there's an old metaphor about the elephant of truth, and the blind men all came up to the elephant, and one said, this elephant is like a rope, and the other said, no, this elephant is like a tree trunk, and another said, the elephant is like a hose. And, I'm sure people are very familiar with this metaphor and old story. And so, it's about the lens you put on what you're talking about, what story you're telling. Filmmakers in here, if you've had any experience with photography or videography, there's something called depth of field. And so when you have a very shallow depth of field, the prints behind me would all be out of focus. If I put a hand up here, it'd be out of focus. Right now, with this camera on my laptop, I have a very wide depth of field. I can see all the things. When you tell a story as a documentary, you have to recognize that your depth of field in the storytelling will be very narrow, and that you're going to be telling a very small slice of what truth is. And you have to make choices. What's going to be in focus in your doc? What's going to be out of focus in your doc? The documentary I referenced earlier about the three-year race against time to build the largest stained glass window in the world, Holy Frit, directed by Justin Monroe. The first cut of that documentary was 8 hours long.
Wow.
1,100 hours of footage. And they had to make choices. What characters do we include? What characters don't we include? What is the focus here? And what is on the periphery and out of focus? And so, they've chosen a straight line of truth that is authentic to the experience. A couple things are out of order, but it's true about the experience. The experience of making this window is told authentically. So that would be my take on objectivity on that sort of question. So again, find me on Twitter. We can talk about it further. Convince me. One last thing I'll mention on that too is, something that's really interesting to kind of see how this works is the 2 documentaries that were produced on the Fire Festival. If you recall, the big shabacle that was the Fire Festival a couple years ago, big festival on an island that didn't happen. There's a doc on Hulu about it. There's a doc on Netflix about it. Watch the 2 of those back to back. Tell me which one is more authentic or which one is more truthful. Good homework.
That's everyone's homework for today. There you go. Ikhwan, you obviously come from a different background in, you're doing these current affairs stories and the layperson will look at that and say, well, it's very important that you tell the truth, whatever that is. How do you feel about what Gillian said and the question in general?
Well, actually, I'm completely on Gillian's side, and I think she pretty much answered. Everything she said, I would have echoed. So I guess what I'll do is I'll give an example of something that I've worked on. I mean, again, everything that she said, that's what I think. It's in the same.
We'll let you go first next time.
No, that's fine. I couldn't have said it better, so I'm glad she said it. I'll just give an example. So we have a issue in Southeast Asia. So every year we have, not every year now because of COVID, there's something to change, but generally every year we have these terrible haze that affects the region. And the haze happens because of the forest fires in Indonesia. So the wind blows the smoke and the ash, and it goes over top sort of Malaysia and Singapore and other countries in this region. And then what you've got Malaysia and Singapore saying to Indonesia, knocking on their door and saying, hey, you're smoking us out and we can't breathe, and the haze is affecting us. Can you stop burning the forest? And Indonesia, the reason why they're burning the forest is to clear. It's the cheapest way to clear land to plant palm oil, and so everyone sort of then goes and blames Indonesia for burning these forests, and then of course, and then later on you sort of find out that some of these companies that are sort of, I guess, accused of burning this land, some of them actually have headquarters in Malaysia and Singapore. So you've got these Malaysia and Singapore saying, we're blaming Indonesia, and hang on now, there's companies over here are causing the haze. So again, it's like, I guess in this particular case, the truth sort of comes out in sort of drips and drabs. And so I actually went to sort of central Kalimantan, which is in Indonesia. So it's one of the hotspots, basically in the middle of the fire season, and it was crazy. I after getting out from the airport, you can sort of hardly breathe, and then you're going in a cab to the hotel, and it's surreal. You just can't sort of imagine it, and then of course when you're there, then you're saying, look, why why are these happening? And then somebody tells you, oh, it's okay, it's because of these someone else. It's because of the smallhold farmers. It's not the companies anymore. It's this. And then you go and speak to them, and they says, oh, it's because of the ethnic tribes here who practice this thing called slash and burn farming. And then when you go and ask them and you talk to them about it, they says, look, we've practiced it for years and it's never caused this. And so every sort of step of the way, you have someone's sort of perspective of why it happens, and then you sort of go further and further into the problem to try and like sort of Gillian said, and I think she was using an example in the playground of putting a camera from a particular perspective, and you don't necessarily see what's behind the tree. So, until you sort of set foot there on the ground and go sort of trampling around and speaking to people, and everyone sort of has their version of the truth, and everyone sort of has a different version of the truth, and I guess what I try and do is I let them try and tell their version of the truth and try and see, and hopefully the authenticity comes through all of that, and people are able to make up their own minds. It's a very complicated matter, and it's sort of like an ongoing problem which can't really be solved. It's just one of these things that that it just like an onion. You just keep on peeling back the layers, and then you just don't know when you're going to get to the sort of the core of it and says that's why this is all happening.
Right. But that's it's a good take on it. It's interesting that you both agree, given your different backgrounds. I thought you would, but I'm glad you did, and gave us all that extra.
Okay, Dara.
Sorry?
I do want to follow up.
Yes.
On that.
Yeah.
I don't think that the idea that objectivity is impossible is an excuse to eliminate other opinions. What he said about, each person has their perspective on why something is happening. That would be a way to aim for objectivity in terms of I'm not taking a side. And I think that's, the key in news is, everyone has their perspective on what happens. In narrative filmmaking, and this is why I think taking a screenwriting course would be valuable for documentary filmmakers, they often say that a good script will allow for multiple worldviews, multiple points of view. If you have a script that has only a character, all the characters have the same worldview or the same view about things, that script is going to be, or that film is going to be a little bit boring, and not as universal in, reception. So it's good to have characters in your story that come from different perspectives, have different worldviews. And so, it makes it more rich, it makes it more compelling, a little more universal. And so, that same is true for documentary storytelling. You want to have those different perspectives in there. I had a screenwriting professor once who said, when in doubt, add conflict. And so, bringing that in is a great, just subtle way or very obtuse way to add conflict. And, the other thing to think about too, when you tell a certain story, same with Fire Festival that I referenced before, there's 2 different docs on the same subject. Anyone can go and make a documentary about Fire Festival. Anyone can go and make a documentary about the same historical event or the same person who lived. When it's a new person making that documentary, it's now that story is being told by you, and that makes it a new story. So, aside from the fact that, objectivity is impossible, that you turn that on its head, make that a good thing. My perspective, my experiences inform the telling of the story in a unique way. So even if you're like, I want to tell a story about this thing that everyone's already, talked about, that's okay. Tell it your version. Okay, last thought on that.
No, that's great. And I think you brought that up in our story session too. Somebody had asked about, how do I tell a story that's been told before? And you said the exact same thing. And I love that, as a writer myself, I love that advice. So that's great. I did have one last question for you, but we are approaching the time where I'd like to start getting some of our questions from our attendees in here. So I think we're going to skip my last question. If we have time at the end, I can always come back to it, but I think instead we'll let Nicole take it away with some of our questions submitted by our attendees.
Thank you so much, Dara, and thank you to both of our amazing guest panelists. You're both incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your plethora of knowledge with us and your different perspectives. We appreciate it so much. So for this portion, we've actually curated a couple of the pre-submitted questions. We had a lot of pre-submitted questions, over 300 questions for you both. So unfortunately, we won't be able to ask 300 questions, but I think we did a really good job of kind of curating, finding really similar threads and questions. So hopefully we'll get a chance to answer or give you some answers to things that you were wondering about. So I guess we can jump right in. The first topic that we'll be talking about is adapting during documentary filmmaking. So the first question, has the subject of your documentary, so I guess any documentary film that you've made, ever changed while making it? So did you have an idea of what it was going to be, and then it kind of changed halfway through or maybe at the end? And Ikhwan, if you want to go first, that would be great.
Sorry, hi. Changed. I wish I had a little bit more time to think about this one, but I don't. The subject changed. I don't think that anything that I've sort of worked on has sort of dramatically changed. So what I sort of start out doing is a sort of a, you know, at the beginning of any documentary, sort of start out doing a lot of research and a lot of reading, and you speak to a lot of people. So when you're sort of creating your structure or laying out your documentary, you sort of have a general idea of it, but at the same time, I don't necessarily try to keep things too tight or lock things too down. So there's always this room for movement, and I think things do sort of meander, is that the right word? You know, sort of sway from side to side, but they don't. I don't think I've worked on something that's sort of dramatically changed, but I think if you were working on sort of, I guess, a feature documentary, and where you started out, you didn't know where it was going to end up, and you were following a profile, and for over a year, that's a different story. That one, you know, I don't think anybody knows where that one sort of turns out, and you sort of end up with a show like, you know, whatever, the one that won the Oscar recently, My Adaptation Teacher. I don't think they sort of knew where that was going when it started, and you know, and it took over a year to film, and I think over a couple of more years to edit. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's I kind of expected that answer, because I guess you have a particular story that you're kind of setting out to cover. So, you know, you cover that story. You know, I guess there is some changes, but maybe not as big as if you're writing something that's more narrative. And with that said, Gillian, I would love to hear your perspective on this one.
It's going to echo Ikhwan a little bit. You know, when I think about the subject of a documentary, it's kind of, to me, that could be my lead character. That could be my main event. And if I'm going in to learn more about a main event, or I'm going in to learn more about a lead character, the peripheries will change. But often that particular character won't, or that particular event won't. Although that has happened. I have seen stories of people who've gone in to research more about perhaps a specific location, and they've learned about stories that happened within that location, and the documentary became about those stories and not so much the location. So Ikhwan said room for movement. I like the phrase room for discovery. And, in my experience, there was one of the LSL Life Hearing First documentaries. With one of those families, we had a particular idea in mind about what was, with all of those, their child was born deaf, and eventually they were using technology to listen and learn to speak. And so that's the structure of the story. This happened, here's what we did because of it, and here's how the kids are thriving today. But we have 12 of them. We can't tell it exactly the same way. So each family has their own unique way they experienced this. And so what is the hook for, terrible word, but it's the truth, for this particular family's version of this story? Like, what was the unique way that they interacted that's a little different from the other families? And so we went in, most of them, it turned out that our pre-interviews were correct. We kind of had a good idea going in. We'd written our questions well, and we got about what we expected. A couple of them, we went in expecting that their emotional journey was a certain way, and what we discovered in the interview process is it wasn't exactly the way that we thought it was, and we discovered a new emotional journey to frame our story on. So that's kind of the ways in which these things can change. I'm working on a feature topical documentary right now, and when I started out with a need to share about an emotional experience that I had, and what I've discovered is that it's actually about a gap in healthcare, and so it became more of like from a personal struggle to legislative action, but the topic's still the same: postpartum care. So within that, it's shifting and moving and growing, kind of like a pregnant body. Sorry, poetry. Anyway, so yeah, you go in with an expectation and make room for discovery.
I love that. Room for discovery, I think, is underrated. I think that is applicable to life and also documentary filmmaking. So thank you so much to you both for those perspectives. I was going to ask another question. Do you go into filming with a set vision of what the edit will look like, or do you let the content you collect during shooting later guide how the story will be structured? I think we kind of went over that, but I wanted to leave it open just in case you had anything else to add to that question in particular. Gillian, it looks like you do. So let's, so you can go ahead and start us off.
Yeah, you have to make a plan. You have to get your people on the boat at the right place at the right time. I had to get high school students in a soccer, field at the right place at the right time. And when we got there, we couldn't shoot the way we thought we could shoot, and so it's you have to at least have a plan. So you've got an idea of what it's going to be so that you actually have something to aim at, and be flexible so that you can change your shot and change your ideas of what it's going to look like in the end. But you have to have a plan. So, the adaptability is key, but you can't just show up on the day and go, I don't know, kick a ball. Like I had soccer players, and so it was like, I have to know what I'm going to get them to do. If it doesn't work, we change it. But for every single one of those specific docs with those students and those children, we went in with a plan of, we're going to film these events this day. And almost every single one of them, there was a hitch somewhere. So you adapt and you adjust. And, the edit doesn't include everything you shot. It doesn't, sometimes everything's completely different. But, you have to have a plan. Otherwise, you're wasting everybody's time.
Good advice. Again, life advice equally as much as documentary filmmaking advice, as Dara said in the chat. Ikhwan, I don't know if you have anything to add to what Gillian said.
she's I think be prepared, and I think I do usually sort of have ideas of maybe like things that you watch in movies or influences or in other docs, and you sort of see how people sort of cut shots together, and I thought, oh, that's I mean, for me it's like I like to experiment sometimes with these sort of things stylistically, and I guess as a filmmaker, you sort of are influenced by the things that you watch and you see around you, and I always like to try new things, and so I do. I don't plan to the extent of every single sequence in the doc, but I mean I plan in the sense like sometimes I'll see something and say, oh, I like how they cut these shots together and how they put that sequence together. I said, I wonder if I can imitate that here, because it might work over there as well, or something like that. But yeah,
that's a really good point too. To discovery, but also experimentation, and taking your favorite things from other documentaries you liked and trying them out for yourself. I think that's great advice and great to add to that question. So hopefully that was enough for that person who asked that question to go out and discover and experiment themselves. So the last question I'll ask in this kind of adapting during filmmaking theme. So somebody asked, when approaching interviews with possible subjects, what are best practices for the approach when it involves unprepped individuals, and how much time do you devote to it to get the part that you need to edit accordingly? So I guess this applies to if you have that one part that you're stuck on that you really want to include in the documentary. Ikhwan, if you want to start with this question, you can. If you need a second, we can pass it over to Gillian.
Yeah, I've got an example for this actually. So
awesome.
I don't. So I was interviewing a sort of a very high-level government official in a Southeast Asian country, and I had this interview for him, and sort of beforehand I met his sort of, I guess, his entourage, and we were talking, and I said, because so there's some people, some profiles, when they're high level, you just don't get to spend the time with them. You don't get a sense of like, okay, are they able to communicate? I guess in this particular case in English, and so okay, so then if they weren't able to communicate English, then I have to find an alternative solution. I go through a translator. Okay, this is how we're going to talk. Anyway, so everyone in his entourage said this guy can speak English. He's fantastic. He's great. And of course it sort of changed the interview, and it didn't really pan out. And so it was a little bit tricky because of the nature of the guy's post. So you have to, in general, you have to be sort of extremely polite, and you just have to judge the situation and see if he's willing to repeat answers. And in this particular case, I think he was willing to do things a couple of times, and I think he wasn't able to maybe articulate things, but it's very hard mid-interview because again of the situation, to tell someone, hey, can we switch languages to make it easier? It's like, I mean, because of the nature of the person's post, so we just sort of struggled on. But normal circumstances, to avoid the pain of that, yes, it would be good to spend. I like to spend, a considerable amount of time chatting with people before I interview them, and sort of getting a sense of what their answers might be, even without having asked them the questions. And then you sort of in your head can then line up. You can sort of, I guess, strategize how are you going to sort of approach, I guess, the questions.
Yeah, that's really fair. That's kind of how I feel about asking questions in webinars too, because I don't really know what you might answer to any particular question. So you kind of have to think on your feet. So I can appreciate that a little bit. Gillian, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, just to give some practical response, advice, and answer to that question. I think that is where, if you're planning a short doc versus a long doc, you can make some adjustments on how long you're going to spend with a person. Generally, I'll spend a little more time than the amount of time I think the doc will be, just as a rough estimate, although that's actually not true. I said that. I actually have spent an hour and a half with people that ended up on a 5-minute doc. And I've spent 2 hours with people that will end up in a 2-hour doc. And so, but I've also spent 20 minutes with people that it's going to end up in a 15-minute doc. So it's kind of, what time do you have? But what Ikhwan said about chatting with them ahead of time, and kind of trying to get a sense of their answers without asking the questions, I think is very good advice. And part of the goal of that is to make a friend as quickly as possible. And in whatever way you can, have them trust you. That you will tell their story well. And so, as a mother, I'm pretty good at that kind of nurturing sort of aspect, and certainly talking with other parents, talking with other mothers. A lot of the docs that I've worked on have been that sort of family-oriented, kid-oriented thing. So I have that sort of tacit ability to, when I'm in the room with a person, make them feel like a friend very quickly. And so that when you sit down, my goal is always to almost pretend we're both just having coffee. And we're just having a conversation. And yes, I have written out my questions, and they are very thorough with notes and bullet points, and I know exactly. So when I look at this, I'm mentally checking, do I have that answer? Do I have that answer? Do I have that answer? But I'm not asking the questions in that order. I'm having a conversation. But when I have a conversation, the way in which I'm having the conversation is very intentional, so that they respond with a sentence that is structured in a way I can use it in my doc. So I made very clear not to ask a yes or no question, so that I don't get a, yeah, I can't use that. So how did you feel when? And, you talk about things like, please include the question in your response, those sorts of practical tips. Oh, when this happened, I felt this, and they can go on in that. And oftentimes that's not the part you use. You use the next thing they said, because then they've ramped up on the difficult part of restating the question, and then they're in their memory, and so then you get the authentic part of the answer. Sometimes you get it right away, and I've asked my question in a way that the response I get is crafted that way. But I've practiced at asking those questions, so that the natural response is a complete sentence and a sentence I can use. And then a little bit from the narrative side, you get the ability to having directed actors. There's a little bit of subtle directing your subject, your interview subject, in terms of how I'm responding to them. Do I need them to be more energetic? I will reflect energy. Do I need them to be a little more subdued and a little more reflective? Then I will reflect that being subdued and reflective as I ask them questions. And so when you're in that situation, you've made the preparation, you've got your list and your questions. Look down, make sure you're mentally getting them. But in the moment, that cocoon with the interview subject is precious. And the practice of having those conversations with cameras and lights is it's a joy for me. I hope you all get to do it. But yeah, I think again, it comes back to, yes, I prepped, but in the moment, I'm looking for authenticity. I'm looking for that universal truth.
That's great, Gillian. And you actually touched on a little bit of what you were alluding to earlier in the webinar, which was structuring questions. And, you know, how do you prepare your interview questions? Do you keep your intentions in mind when asking the questions? So, you know, structuring them and making sure that when you ask those questions, what you're going to get back is authentic from memory, that sweet spot when somebody's just like telling you their own story and they don't even need to think about it. You know, it's just flowing. But yeah, do you have any other advice to add when structuring questions, and how do you kind of prepare for that? Ikhwan, I guess you can jump in and then we can come back to Gillian to follow up.
Sure. I don't know if my method is something that's advisable, but I kind of consistently rewrite my questions. I have this sort of, I go through and I write the questions that I think I want to ask, and then I, you know, maybe a couple of days later when I go through it, I realize, this is rubbish, and I sort of rewrite them, and then you know, you go a couple of days later, and then you kind of, I have to sort of stay away from it. Sometimes I have to sort of actively tell myself, okay, let's just leave it alone, and then of course before shoot, I'll look at it, and then usually the night before the interview, then I'll go over the questions again, and then if I find myself again rewriting them again, so it's kind of a constant rewrite of questions on my part. The thing is, when you're actually sitting down to do the interview, as Gillian has said, sometimes I kind of throw all the questions away and I just talk. So I think what the questions do is they help me sort of frame things and sort of get my thoughts sort of straight over a long period of time. And so by the time that I've sat down with the person that I'm speaking with, a lot of the times I don't even look at my questions anymore. And sometimes I ask different questions from what I've written about. So it's I think for me, it's this thing where I sort of constantly refine. I guess other people might have different sort of experiences with that. Yeah, sometimes as well, I have a problem with myself sometimes writing multiple questions in a single question. So I think it's always difficult trying to go through my questions, trying to separate them out and trying to understand what I'm thinking about. But yeah, okay, I'll let Gillian take over.
Writing is rewriting. I think that's true in narrative, playwriting, screenwriting, novel writing, documentary question writing, documentary writing. Writing is rewriting, always rewriting. But specifically related to questions, I think for me, I come back to actually screenwriting, and I think about my characters in my story, and what I think about it in terms of voices. I have, I have varied voices, varied characters in my story, and what does this voice represent? What does this voice represent, and what do I need them? What version of the story do I need them to tell? What perspective on the story do I need them to tell? And so, I'm not going to write the same 10 questions and ask them to every single character, or every single cast member, every single person I interview with a particular documentary. Some of them I will want the exact same question, and I might pepper it with all of their answers in a little sequence. Others of them I will ask the question in this way, and the other person I'll ask the question this way. And others, I'll ask completely different questions. So it depends on who you're talking to and what you need them to add to your story, how you generate those questions for them. And so, yeah, when prepping questions, I'm thinking, what is the fullness of what I need this person to contribute? If I was writing a screenplay, where would they start? What would they flesh in? Where would they finish? And how do I structure my questions to make sure I get the completeness there? And so, you know, in some cases where I know very clearly I'm going to have someone say, my child was born with hearing loss, you know, and in a certain way, a certain day, a certain time, you know, I'll make sure I've got that question. But I'm also, with those, you know, documentaries, looking for a lovely button, something to close on, and something that, you know, ends us with a hopeful note. And so I am listening the whole time. Did I hear it? And I've got, you know, some situations where I end up, I'll write a question in hope to get that. And sometimes I get that in that question, the answer to that question. Other times I don't. Depends on the people who I'm talking, where we're at in the interview. But I'm always listening. Did I get this part of what I need from them? Did I get this part of what I need from them? Did I get my button? And a couple interviews, I got 3 really great buttons, and I was like, oh, wow, that's awesome. I can choose. And some other interviews, like, oh, I got the one. Okay, that'll work. It's fine. We got to move on. So, I mean, that's when you draft those questions, think about what their answer, you hope for their answer to be. So you start from the place of the hope. You know, if they're providing your entire VO, what is the hope you have for that entire VO? And what would the question be to get you those answers? So that's a lot easier with a 5-minute or a 15-minute. When you're looking at a 2-hour, think, okay, this particular voice is telling me a certain part of the story. And this other voice is telling me a certain other part of the story. So how do I craft the questions to get that part of the story that I need? That would be my advice there. Hope that helps.
Great advice. Great advice. It's honestly giving me really good advice for looking at questions for the next webinar and structuring that. So selfishly, I love both the answers. Thank you so much. So we have about 15 more minutes left of the webinar. So for the sake of time and hitting on all of the themes, the running themes from all of the lovely questions we've had submitted so far, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about some funding and some pitching advice for documentary film. Great general question that was submitted. Could you discuss your experience writing grants or raising funds for your work? What are some of the ways to get funding to create a documentary film? And are there any best practices that you could suggest or relay to our participants? Gillian, I guess you could go first, and then we can circle back to Ikhwan.
I know we have people from all over the world here. So I don't think it serves to talk about how you fund in America. There's documentary.com. There's PBS. There's lots of different websites you can go to find lists of funding grants, and you can do that work if you're in America. If you're in Canada, you can look at your municipal, provincial, and federal websites. Lots of great resources, because it's I know it's structured a little bit differently in Canada. Around the world, I can't say. Look at your local government, see if they help. I know in a lot of Scandinavian countries, there are lots of grants for filmmakers. I have friends that work out of there. Ikhwan probably can hopefully speak to his neck of the woods. But that would be just a general, look at your local governments and see what's happening. In America, it's a lot more funding agencies, that sort of thing, like nonprofits. But another way to look at it is, can I partner with an organization that is doing this work, that is interested in this topic, that is connected to this person? Are there companies that may have specific funds for project-based experiences or specific projects that might be willing to partner with me to tell this story? Whether that's I don't know, $5,000 to $50,000 to $500,000. So that's one way to think about it. Like if you have a specific topical documentary and there's a service organization that works with that, they have ways of finding specific project-based funds. So that would be another thing to think about. Crowdfunding, we can all look at crowdfunding. Find your niche, find the people that are concerned with those things and get in their Facebook groups and those sorts of things, and then share your post. You have to Student Spark talks about finding your audience first and then asking them for money, rather than trying to find your audience through the ask for money. That's one of the, I think, greatest things that came out of Student Spark, and their resources there. They have a lot of great resources too about funding. So I mean, the key thing here is partnership. You're looking for people to work with you. But one of the great things about documentary filmmaking is I can take my camera, if it's a quality enough camera, and go out and tell a story. And I've got my editing software. I can do the free resources to learn how to use it, and I can cut together something. Take your time. Good, fast, cheap. Pick any two. You take your time. You can tell a good story with accessible gear and share it with an audience. I mean, here we are in 2021. We can do that. Are you trying to share it with PBS? Well, then go on PBS, look at their resources, that sort of thing. It depends on what your audience is, I think, when it comes to funding. And so, I've worked on stuff that I've funded myself. I've worked on stuff that other people have funded. And we worked on stuff that have, where people have raised the money for it, and so it's like, there's so many different ways of going about it. And you have to think, what am I telling? Who's going to want to partner with me? So plethora of answers to that question. So like, here's the specific way you go about it. It's going to depend.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's so different depending on where you're located. I know that in Newfoundland in particular, like arts organizations are a huge source for funding indie filmmakers, documentary film. But like you said, government is also a great place to look for those grants. Ikhwan, I don't know if you have anything to add about what funding is available or what grants are available in Singapore or in Asia in general.
So I think funding is not great in Asia. I was working in a sort of a small documentary house in Malaysia, and there was always this constant thing on our minds of, okay, we've got to pitch for something, we've got to try and get funding for the next show, and it is a sort of a big commitment as well to put together a pitch reel and to submit for funding and to travel because of the nature of things. So there are a couple of forums that are available for funding, though it is quite difficult to get sort of an independent doc funded in Asia. I think most of the funding comes from the sort of the major networks. So in Japan, you've got NHK, and in Korea, KBS, and in China, CCTV. And so what happens is that there is a sort of a forum where all these television stations sort of get together and they have pitches, and people will go there and pitch, and they do fund shows, but they usually require, this is the tricky part, they usually require, so if you are let's say a Malaysian, for instance, and you go to NHK and you pitch a doc, and NHK said, oh great, I'd like to fund that, but they will say you need to come with Malaysian funding as well. So then you've got to then go and cobble together or try and convince sort of a Malaysian funding agency to try and jump on board as well, this thing that NHK wants to do, and then you've got to make the co-pro work. It's not easy, and I think because of that, not many docs get made. How I see it happening at the moment is, so you've got a bunch of news organizations like South China Morning Post, In Singapore, you've got Channel News Asia, and what these companies do is you can pitch to these companies. They sort of, so what happens is with all these companies, they can't produce all the hours. They can't turn over all the hours that they need to produce for a 24-hour news channel. And they have them in Korea and NHK and all the other Asian countries. So what they do is they outsource a lot of stuff, and so that's how I think one of the best ways to try and get funding in Asia is probably to approach one of the major networks and see. But it's tricky. It's tricky. I think if you're doing independent stuff in Asia at the moment and you're pitching, I think a pitch reel is almost I don't want to say mandatory, but it's kind of needed. It's very difficult to pitch something off a piece of paper nowadays, unless it's screaming off the paper. Otherwise, you'd need to spend a little bit of money and go out there and actually shoot a short, I don't know, 3-minute, 5-minute pitch reel and take that along with you to the funders. And I think it's kind of required. I don't want to say that, but yeah, it's tricky.
Absolutely. And, just thankful to have the perspective that, these things are varying, but there are certain things that you can think about or work towards creating to kind of help yourself get there. Creating a pitch, getting funding, it's challenging no matter where you are, but definitely some places have those things that you definitely want to know before you commit to getting your idea out there. But I believe in every single person here that if they wanted to do it, they could do it. We all have the will. And where there's a will, there is a way. But thank you so much for sharing that, Ikhwan. We're almost done. I don't know how you feel about answering one or two more questions. There's about 4 minutes left to the webinar. It might run a little bit long, but if you're in, I can keep asking.
I'm fine. No worries.
All right, sounds great. So we'll pivot a little bit to answering some questions about ethics in documentary filmmaking. So there was a question submitted. So this person asks, hailing from a post-colonial context, I am familiar with debates around Orientalism and the colonial mentality, and think it's high time we hold constructive discussions around the gray areas in the politics and ethics of representation. Who has the right to represent, and what are the responsibilities they must bear? Can a representative legitimately capture a lived reality? It's a very unique and I think a very complex question to ask, but I'm very excited to hear your perspectives on it. Ikhwan, I don't know if you want to tackle this question first.
Yeah. It is a sort of I guess an issue that's coming up more and more especially in Southeast Asia, because a lot of Southeast Asia was actually, so I guess in the 19th century, it was carved up by sort of colonial powers. So, Indonesia went to the sort of, they drew a line there, say Indonesia, okay, Dutch, you guys take it, and then sort of Malaysia and Singapore, and then they sort of carved it up and said, okay, British, you guys take that part, and then Vietnam and Philippines and I think only Thailand was spared, but and Myanmar as well. So these countries, are all sort of, I guess, living through some sort of I guess, post-colonial teething issues. I made a show again on my on Borneo, so where I was born. It just so happened that there was a very sort of I guess a well-known colonial who came to Borneo and sort of became known as the White Raja. So it was he became this, I guess, a king of a part of Sarawak, and so this I sort of told the story in a documentary. It was very interesting to retrace the roots of this. So it was hosted by an academic from one of the universities in Singapore, and we sort of went on this journey along the coast and sort of, I guess, retracing how he landed and how he moved along the coast and sort of, I guess, did some, I guess, pretty horrific things as throughout the state, sort of killing a lot of the ethnic tribes people in the name of piracy. And I guess that's what one of the things that we explored in that show, which was called Kings and Pirates, was who's the king and who's the pirate, and I one of the last seasons of that was I kind of was it was quite interesting. So we were talking with the presenter Farish and I, and he had these fantastic sort of collection of images that were done, and there was these drawings of these pirates, and then we sort of were talking about it and said, hey, why don't we take these and we'll go and show them to one of these guys who lives on an island and see what he says. And so we were sitting there in this wooden hut sort of above the ocean, and we were showing these guys and saying, hey, this is what your ancestors were. They were pirates according to these images, and it was very interesting because he sort of, I guess, we had this discussion with him and who is the pirate and who are they and are they us, and because they are just the island people who live along the coast there. And so it's a lot about perspectives, how it's seen and how history has seen some of these people. I think there's a film coming out about this actually, so they're turning it into a feature film as well, the White Raja. So I'll be interested to see what happens there. But yeah, it's I think an issue that a lot of countries here are dealing with. Yeah.
That was a lot of info. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I think that's a lot to think about, and especially your responsibility maybe as a documentary filmmaker to think about these things, and when you're watching stories, to think about who is behind the camera and who's in front of the camera and how that kind of plays out. Gillian, I don't know if you have anything to add, but if so, please.
So I think of it in terms of partnership. I think it's worth asking who has the right to tell a story. I think that's worth asking. I think it's worth talking about. But as we move forward on a practical day-to-day basis as storytellers, it's about partnership and permission. If I go to someone and I ask, can I interview you for this documentary? Can I follow you? I'm asking for them to partner with me. Are they telling their story? Am I telling their story? There's a lot of different ways to look at that. If I have final cut, yes, it's me telling the story. They've chosen what to say. How do I cut it together? Can I change what they say? Possibly. Why would I do that? So, it's people I'm putting my trust in them, they're putting their trust in me. Where's the balance of power? I think these are questions to ask as you go forth. And think about, why should they trust me to tell their story? Why should they partner with me to tell their story? Am I going to tell it authentically? Am I going to tell it in a way that reveals universal truth? Will I be trustworthy? I'm sure most people here are familiar with the old thing, history books are written by those who won the wars. But here we are with new technology and able to ask new questions or old questions and unearth things. What can we unearth? What can we discover together in this process of storytelling? Do we put up barriers by asking these questions, or can we tear down barriers by asking these questions? If I partner with someone to tell their story of an experience I haven't had, does that help us all, or does that hurt us all? And my goal is to help us all. I can't say the same for every other documentarian. I would hope that it is, but I do want to highlight a specific documentary. I didn't have any part in it, but some producers my husband, who's an editor, had worked with one of them at some point. So this is how I know about it. It was lovely. It's called For Akeem, Ahkeem, for FOR, Akeem. It was released in 2017, and it's 100% verite. There's no interview. And this documentary, the producers had pitched it. They were going to make a documentary about the kind of school to prison pipeline that exists in a lot of places in America. They didn't know what that documentary was going to look like, so they went to a certain town, can't recall the state right now, and followed various students in this particular school. And after a couple weeks of following students, found one particular teenage girl who had a certain vivacity and presence about her, and was narrowing down on some pretty harrowing life experiences. So they talked to her mother, backing up. These producers, and this pair of producers and directors are two white men. And they talked with her mother. She's a young black girl, young black high school girl. And they said, "Are you willing?" And they asked her, the young girl, "Are you willing?" And it was a lot of conversations, probably a couple of days, maybe weeks worth of conversations before the family said yes. Did they have a right to tell that story? I feel edified having experienced that version of her experience. What I learned of her, I feel, made me stronger. I'm grateful that they partnered together. I don't think I can say yes or no, but I can say, let's keep asking the question and let's keep partnering.
I think that's incredibly important questions to ask as somebody providing that platform, providing, helping to provide that opportunity, asking yourself if it's a partnership or if it's something else, and if it's something else, if it should maybe be a partnership instead. Really powerful question. Thank you so much to the person who asked it. Incredibly important question to ask, and I think a really powerful way to maybe clue up this webinar. So thank you both so much. I'm going to pass it over to Dara for some closing remarks. I'm kind of sad about it because I really don't want this to end, maybe. But I guess it has to end sometime. But thank you both. And over to you, Dara.
Thanks, Nicole.
I agree with Nicole. That was an amazing question to end on, as much as we don't want to end. Poor Ikhwan is headed towards midnight there, isn't it? It's just after midnight where you are. Oh, you're on mute. Oh.
Yes, it's a little bit after midnight, but yes, it's fine. I'm still awake.
Well, I'm glad you stayed awake for us. Fascinating responses from both of you, and we really want to, from all of us here at Celtx and everyone who's in attendance today, really just thank you so much for giving us your time and taking on these great questions. And
thanks so much.
Thanks. And for everyone who did attend and all of you who stuck with us even as we ran late, thank you for joining us. We're really pleased to have you here. And we love the questions that everyone submits, and we hope to continue to see you at our next month's webinar, which is going to be on narrative design in game and VR. So that's going to be a really interesting one to catch. And in the meanwhile, you will be receiving a recording of this webinar in approximately 1 week. We do take some time to edit it and make sure it looks pretty for everyone. And after this webinar, you will be receiving a survey email, as well as we will announce the winner of that 1 free year of a Celtx Pro Studio. So before I let everyone go, Gillian, Ikhwan, did you have any closing remarks of your own, or no?
I will say I know there was a couple questions about editing, both in the chat and previously submitted. So if anyone wants to find me on Twitter and has questions about that, I'm happy to discuss and give any insights I can. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
thanks. Thank you so much, Gillian. And we'll make sure to include her Twitter handle in the email that we're going to send out to you shortly with the survey. All right, so on that note, we will let everyone go. Again, thank you for attending our Documentary Filmmaking Professional Perspectives webinar, and we hope to see you again next month. And big props out to Gillian and Ikhwan so much. Thank you for helping us out today.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.